Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Andrew McAfee.
Always a pleasure. So Andy, interesting thing happened yesterday in Richmond. Eric Cantor got defeated, Tea Party candidate.
We've been hearing about that.
Yeah, I've noticed it on the news. All of this roiling of the Tea Party and the legitimate concerns of a lot of people that, man, my world's changing in ways that I feel a loss of control on. Is this just a byproduct of the Great Recession, or is there something technological underneath this?
You can imagine what my answer to this is going to be, right?
That's what you call a soft.
Yeah, we usually think of Tom as asking harder questions than that. And I have to say, Tom, it was a thrill to have you give our George Jetson one joke from the stage. Yeah. You know you've arrived when Tom Friedman starts using your one-liners. That is just a good day.
I appreciate it.
But to answer your question, absolutely not. This is not just a Great Recession phenomenon. When you look at the data about what's been happening to the economy, to the workforce, to jobs and wages, you notice this kind of, there was a bunch of different words. There's a polarization, there's a decoupling, there's a deterioration in the prospects for the average family. It goes back decades, that's bad enough. The more challenging news is that it really seems to be accelerating probably since the turn of the century. So these stresses that we're seeing, it's very clear they're not just a product of the Great Recession.
So what is the trend line, and why the acceleration?
The trend line is, my favorite term for it is hollowing out, which my colleague back at MIT, David Otter, has been the guy that's been documenting it best. It's exactly like you say, that the things that led to this large, stable, prosperous middle class that we've had in this country for the post-war era, those things really seem to be fraying or falling apart, or just not as available as they once were. Your phrase is a high-wage job at a mid-skill level. Like you say, there just aren't as many of those. You can start to track the decline of those kinds of jobs and the pressure on wages going back as early as the 80s. I don't think it's a coincidence that that's really the start of the PC era and this amazing democratization of powerful technologies.
Well, you've talked about these three things that all seem to be growing together at the same time: productivity, median wages, and employment.
Yeah.
What's happened to those trends?
So the really happy phenomenon of the post-war decades was this lockstep progression upward in some things that we care a great deal about. Output, good old-fashioned GDP, labor productivity, the number of jobs in the country, job growth, and then average wage growth as well. If you plot those four lines, they are indistinguishable. They just grow at the same rate up until about 1980, when the wage line starts to taper off. And
PCH,
then, PCH, and then more recently the job growth line starts to taper off as well. And that's evident, again, even before the Great Recession kicked in. That certainly accelerated the phenomenon, but my colleague Eric and I have invented the world's dorkiest dance move to describe the phenomena that's going on, because we keep on going like this when we describe what's happening. So we call this the Great Decoupling. Output and productivity are still on not a perfect, but a relatively healthy trajectory. Wages and jobs have started to decouple, and the spread between those has started to go up.
And the way you've explained it is that there were things that we assumed machines could never do. That talk about this progression, that for so many years the machine was your friend, and now increasingly it's becoming your enemy.
It's becoming a substitute for things you can do instead of just a pure complement. You mentioned how much has changed since 2004 when you wrote The World is Flat. Yeah. There was another fantastic book that came out in 2004 where a couple of colleagues of ours tried to pin down what it was that people were good at versus machines were good at. And they did amazing work. And what they said people were inherently better at were these two very basic tasks of pattern matching and complex communication.
Give examples of that. What does that mean?
So Exhibit A in their book of a really tough pattern matching task that we do that machines are lousy at was driving a car in traffic. And they made a really compelling case. You got to take in all this information. You got to match it against what's going on. You got to match it against the formal and the informal rules of the road. You have to do it reliably and repeatedly, because failure is really a bad news when you're driving. So I read the book in 2004, and Eric read it. And we kind of nodded and said, okay, they nailed that. 6 years later, Google, in a blog post, announces that they had been driving cars completely autonomously in traffic. So we actually had the chance to ride in the Google car a couple summers ago. It works as advertised. It was the smoothest, actually the most boring ride I've ever had by the end, because it's about as exciting as the monorail that takes you from your gate to the terminal at an airport. It just goes to show how quickly our best thinking and our most careful research about this boundary between digital versus human, that boundary is really getting blurry and shifting super quickly.
What other examples do you see? I mean, I cited the, milking cows with a robot. What other sort of really conventional jobs are now getting wiped out in ways that blue-collar jobs, happened in the 80s and 90s?
Yeah, so we're looking at a lot of cognitively demanding jobs. Writing good English prose, as you well know, is surprisingly hard to do. It turns out we've got software now where if you give it a body of data, it will tell a story about that data in clean English prose, and that story will have an arc, it will have a voice, it won't read the same. If it writes up successive baseball games, it won't feel like it came out of a cookie cutter. They can scale that up infinitely. We can write up Little League games as easily as we can write up MLB games now. So we've got this astonishing leverage with technology, and that leverage is spreading into more and more domains that we used to think of as relatively high skill, relatively secure. A medical pathologist is one of the most highly trained physicians. They spend years looking at stuff to get their pattern matching abilities really well honed. A couple of recent studies have shown that digital pathologists are at least as good as very highly trained human pathologists. My punchline to that is, as soon as Dr. Watson's available, I really want him as my primary care physician.
You're describing a robotic columnist there.
I'm getting close, right?
So Andy, then what's left for the rest of us?
Amazingly enough, the game of chess gives me a really good handle for thinking about what's left for the rest of us. Because at first glance, chess seems like this area where we have clearly lost out to the machines. Garry Kasparov lost to Deep Blue in 1997, and ever since then, the race against the machine, that head-to-head competition, has become more and more lopsided and really more and more boring. It's so bad that they asked a grandmaster a little while back how he would prepare for a match against a computer, and he said, I'd bring a hammer. Right? So it's just profound.
Yeah,
except when you start letting teams of people plus chess computers play against other teams of people plus chess computers, then you learn something really wild, which is that the best team will beat Kasparov. It will beat the world's fastest chess supercomputer. It will beat Kasparov with the world's best chess supercomputer, because the right team is composed of human geeks of two different flavors. They're kind of chess geeks, but they're really digital geeks as well. And they have spent the time to really deeply understand what they can add versus what the computer does. That's so far an unbeatable chess team. And what it appears is happening is that the people are still the ones who come up with the spark, the new idea, some kind of eureka. And then they essentially say to the computer, hey, double check me on this. Is this a stupid idea or not? And the computer says, yeah, 4 years later, you're going to get in big trouble if you go that way. Or, yeah, that actually seems pretty good. So even in these really well-plowed fields, this notion of our ability to come up with a eureka or ideation, that really seems to be still ours and still really, really valuable.
But you said something interesting. It's team plus technology. Not necessarily individual plus technology anymore.
It's definitely team plus technology, and it's properly composed team. And if I could give you the super quick recipe, I don't think I would, because I'd write it in a book first and try to sell some books that way. But we don't know. I don't think we know the ground rules of how to compose that team right now. To me, that makes this time, like you keep saying, so exciting. Because we're going to iron that out in the years to come, and the people and the companies that get that right are just going to have massive success.
Because it then brings technology back as a complement, not a substitute.
Yeah, and if we need to stop thinking about ourselves, we probably contributed to this with the title in one of our books, Race Against the Machine. That's really the wrong mindset to have. I can't think of a corner of the economy, I can hardly think of a job that's not going to have a lot more digital technology associated with it. Dairy farmer, like you pointed out, is now a digitally complemented job. But the right way to think about it is how are we going to work in tandem with these astonishing machines to make ourselves more valuable and to deliver value out there to the world?
So then let me ask you a question. I'm going to ask everybody. which is what then do you think that means for K-12 education and post-secondary education? Knowing what you know about where this is going technologically and what seems to be working, how do we work back into the school system?
So you've got people later on today who are much better qualified than I am to talk about that. Two things seem really clear to me. Very few people are going to have one job for life going forward, or even one career or one industry for life. Our educational systems have to set people up to be more flexible and adaptable. The other thing is our systems themselves need to be a lot more open to experimentation and to figuring out what works, because this transition is such a powerful one. The things that we've been doing are pretty clearly not going to work. Sitting around in a little grid of desks and working on the 3 Rs, that's a great way to turn out the workers we needed just about a century ago. We need to experiment a hell of a lot more to figure out and solidify what we need going forward.
You know, one of the things we've talked about in the past, Andy, is a really, though, disturbing statistic that startups seem to be slowing down.
Yeah.
And it's counterintuitive in a way in this technological age. Why do you think that's happening? What are the implications of that?
This is, I think, the most dire trend that I see. There's plenty of dire economic news out there. The one that really makes me say, holy Toledo, is what you point out, that this astonishing American startup culture, this entrepreneurial culture, is heading in the wrong direction. And that sounds crazy to say in 2014 in San Francisco, in the era of WhatsApp and Snapchat and Instagram and these just home run successes. That's not really what entrepreneurship means in America. It's awesome, it's fantastic, we want more of it, but entrepreneurship means starting up the car wash or starting up a home repair service. That is pretty clearly on the decline. It's been going on for at least 15, 20 years. And we see it show up in things like in previous recessions. The job growth came not from big established companies, but from fast-growing young ones.
Right. All net new jobs come
all
from
net new jobs come from fast-growing young companies.
Yeah.
That is not the case anymore. That spigot is really being turned off. We got to figure out what's going on. We got to reverse the course here. You ask, why is that happening? My community is really scratching its head about that because it's such a fundamental question. We don't know the answer for sure. A couple things that seem clear are the thicket of regulations is getting more and more dense at the local, state, federal level. When a would-be entrepreneur confronts that thicket, they might be this is not worth my time. A couple silly examples. Right now in Tampa, Florida, I think you mentioned Uber in your opening remarks. In Tampa, Florida, a limo has to wait at least an hour before picking you up and has to charge at least $50.
That's kind of anti-Uber legislation.
Yeah, that's pro-taxi, it's anti, and that's ridiculous. Mickey Mouse is still under copyright. So we have these point examples that are ridiculous, but they add up and they form this thicket that gets in the way of entrepreneurship. I also think that because our healthcare system is as weird as it is, that the idea of lancing yourself out there and not having any health care is a real barrier to entrepreneurship as well. So there are plenty of barriers out there. We'd better identify which ones are the big ones, and we'd better work on knocking them down.
I think another thing that happened is the bankruptcy laws changed, and so many starter-uppers used their Visa cards as their seed capital, and I think that's also back into
and just to pile on, one more is that the immigration system in this country is so backward and Byzantine and messed up. I can't tell you how many of my friends out here who are starting companies, growing like weeds, say that their biggest barrier to faster growth is they can't get the talent that they need from around the world. We have this astonishing good fortune that the A-team still wants to come here to do their work and build their careers. Why we make that difficult for them is just an enduring mystery for me.
So I'm sure you get this question all the time from parents, but we got a lot of parents out there. What do you tell parents about preparing your kid for this world? I give very parochial advice on this. I tell parents that I was a Montessori kid, and I'm so thankful for that, because what that system taught me, a lot of us know, right? It's this completely hippie style of education where there are no grids, there's no curricula, there's no math now and history now. Instead, just little kids wander into this environment, and what it taught me was that the world is a super interesting place.
And my job, even as a little kid, is not to passively absorb stuff from some adult, but to go poke at the world in ways that were intriguing to me. I think that served me astonishingly well. In tech, there's what we call a Montessori mafia. It turns out that people like the founders of Wikipedia and Amazon and Google were all Montessori kids. I don't think that's entirely a coincidence. So these educational systems that encourage this sense of discovery as early as possible in life, I think that's fantastic. At the level of higher ed, you'd better treat college as a time to really fill up your toolkit. The silly advice I give is go spend time on both sides of campus. Go spend time with the math nerds or the computer science nerds on one side of campus, and the drama geeks or the English geeks on the other side of campus. Filling up both halves of your brain seems to be a super valuable thing to do.
Interesting. Book out this year, Thomas Piketty, on capitalism. Gotten a huge amount of attention. But one of the things I noticed is almost no McAfee and Brynjolfsson in that book. There's really not much about technology at all.
Yeah, it gets a passing mention in the book.
So how do you relate to his argument?
2 parts. It's an astonishing piece of scholarship, because what Piketty and his colleagues did was go grab data for about 2.5 centuries from as many countries as they could around the world to document trends in inequality, both in income and in wealth. And their data gathering is not perfect. When you do that right. scale, it's never going to be perfect. Yeah. It's really, really good. It's world-class good. And what they document, like you know, is Piketty talks about this inherent trend of capitalism toward very, very high levels of inequality. Maybe that'll be borne out in the future, maybe it's not. There's certainly a lot of signs going that way. But I don't think he gives technology enough due for both the inequality increasing things that it does, but also the benefits that it brings to everybody. In particular, the weird thing about his book to me was, to the extent he's got solutions, it's let's make sure there aren't any really rich people out there anymore.
Yeah, it seems to be more about making rich people poor than poor people rich.
And the concerns of the middle and the bottom, they're almost absent from that book. It's deeply weird. Yeah. He talks about the 75% versus the 1% versus the 0.001%. Is that the ball we need to have our eye on going forward? I don't think so.
Well, let's talk about that, because I think 2 of the most interesting chapters in your book are at the end, where you talk about the new social contract we might need for this age. So talk about 2 things, Andy. One is the trend line, okay? And I like your image of the chessboard, kind of where we are technologically. So, and if that's the trend line, then what kind of new social contract do we need as a society? And it picks up on Piketty, in order to have a stable America.
Yeah, and that's going to be the question that's going to confront us, I believe, over the next generation. Certainly, we're going to see this issue come to the fore much more, because the technology trend line has a very specific shape to it. It's exponential. It just keeps on going like this over any scale. And that's not about to stop. Moore's law, as far as I can tell, is not about to run out of steam in the next 5 or 10 years. Our digital stuff is going to continue to astonish us. You mentioned big data in your opening remarks. I did a silly calculation a little while back. I asked the question, people talk about oceans of data. I said, okay, let's say there was actually an ocean of data already in 2007. How much data is there in the world in 2014? Based on my silly back-of-the-envelope calculation, if we had an ocean in 2007, we've got a volume of water covering the entire Earth about 9 times as high as Mount Everest in 2014. That trend is not about to stop. So the technology trend is pretty clear. The social trend and how that intersects with that, that's what we need to think about. The conclusion that Eric and I came to when we wrote the book is work is just an unbelievably valuable thing for a person, for a community. We came across this great quote from Voltaire, who said that work saves us from 3 great evils: boredom, vice, and need. Of those 3, the need is the easiest one to take care of. We're a very affluent society. We could just hand out enough money to let people live. That's not our problem. Our problem is, what's the quality of that life going to be? Is it meaningful? Is it engaged? Is it a deep one in any sense of the word? And if not, we need to figure out how we encourage that kind of depth or that kind of engagement. Because when you look at what happens to people when work goes away or people at the bottom of that income distribution, most of the social trends you see are really, really worrying ones.
I want to say we got time for a couple of questions. There are microphones in the front. And before we do go to them, just ask you quickly, please raise your hand or just come up to the mic at the front if anyone has a question.
While we're doing that, can I bring up one other point on the social contract?
Please.
You bring up this really vivid example of Jamba Juice in New York and how they can schedule everything in 15-minute increments. Okay, they can. Does that mean they should? Right. Do you really want to treat your employees like that kind of swappable input to production, and they have nothing else to do except sit home and wait for the call to come into Jamba Juice?
And that was actually going to be my next question. Should we slow all this down?
The last thing I would ever want to do is slow down the progress of technology or try to channel it too carefully. The main thing that technology does is grow the overall pie. That's awesome. We need to, I think it's the best economic news on the planet. We need to keep it going. What we need to think about is what flavor pie, I guess, do we want to have? Because we get to make that choice. Our technology is not picking the society and the world that we're creating. Our values are what's going to pick up on, or what's going to create that.
Terrific. Quick question.
I wanted to ask you about...
Giselle, we did tell us your name again and where you're from. So
I'm sorry. Giselle Huff from San Francisco. I'm with the Jacqueline Newman Foundation.
Okay.
So the description you gave of work, the Voltaire quote, is something that's stuck in the previous paradigm, right? If, in fact, half of the jobs that, as we know them, in the world disappear in the next 30, 40 years, we're not going to have an option, right? I mean, it isn't going to be to train to do something meaningful in the workspace because essentially the workspace won't exist anymore. So do we have to start thinking about how we educate our children, how we start thinking about ourselves as not workers, but thinkers, doers, artists?
People.
People.
Yeah.
Good question.
This is a lovely, lovely question. In our conversation, I usually focus on what we need to do in the short term to kickstart the economy, to put people back to work, because that's the challenge we face in the short term. Giselle's point, though, is, which I completely agree with, I think in my lifetime, let's say I got 40, 50 years left, in my lifetime, I honestly think I'm going to see us within this amazingly abundant economy that just doesn't need that much human labor. Okay, what do the humans do in that economy? I don't think that's the pressing question for us to focus on today and tomorrow, but it is a pressing question for us to focus on over the next generation, because what a meaningful life consists of when it's not dominated by a job and a work and a career, a lot of people in this room are going to see that world and confront it.
I had a quote from Walter Russell Mead, the historian, and we'll go to your question. He said, in the 19th century, most Americans spent their time working with animals and plants outdoors in the country. In the 20th century, most Americans spent their time pushing paper in offices or bashing widgets in factories. In the 21st century, most of us are going to work with people, providing services that enhance each other's lives. We're going to have to discover the inherent dignity of work that is people to people rather than people to things. We're going to have to realize that engaging with other people, understanding their hopes and their needs, and using our own skills, knowledge, and talent to give them what they want at a price they can afford will be honest work.
And awesome. And if there is not a company willing to pay you or me to go engage with those people in those deep, meaningful ways, let's figure out how we give those people the means to earn a living. Because that problem is not going to go away.
Over here. Yeah, introduce yourself.
Bill O'Connor, worked for Autodesk, design software company, San Francisco.
Great company.
Thank you very much. Yeah, love your book. Love your books and columns.
Thanks so much.
Love.
Yeah.
Let's take the love is given.
That's my question. Thank you.
Can we all follow that template? That was fantastic.
Gotta go.
So one of the even though we're a tech company, or maybe because we think a lot about education. One of the triptychs we see is sort of like, well, you have work, and work is being massively changed by technology at a rate that's sometimes hard to comprehend. Over here, you have the education industry trying to prepare people for that work, right? So the question I have is, given that technology itself is moving so quickly and changing work so quickly, what techniques or methods have either of you guys seen that allows the education world to grasp this and not to lag so far behind, something that's moving so quickly? I'm curious, what have either of you guys seen that's successful at getting education to catch up?
It's a wonderful question. Let me just say, I don't want to give Andy a chance to answer, that Sebastian Thrun is going to be with us shortly. It is something that we're going to talk about specifically.
Yep.
I'll steal just one of Sebastian's lines, which is that we're really moving into an Uber world. What is Uber? It's actually on demand.
Yep.
It's service on demand. And if we move into a world of service on demand, we're going to need education on demand.
And nobody's doing a better job of pushing that envelope than Sebastian, so I won't steal his thunder. My one-word answer to your question is competition. My home industry, higher education, is an extraordinarily slow-moving industry. It is not going to change on its own, and it's only going to change when the employers of the world, I believe, start valuing other kinds of preparation and other signals about credentials more than the good old-fashioned BA, MA, PhD. Bring on the competition, please.
Time for one more quick one. Thank you.
My name is Tom Kacharby from San Francisco, and actually I just wrote a book on this prescription that you said is needed.
What's the name of the book?
As of this morning.
Oh, gotcha.
Yeah, we're in that phase.
Yeah, it's the pub back and forth with the publisher.
Okay.
Designing and controlling a career built around your life goals.
Okay, great.
But
Question.
first of all, I love both your books also.
Thank you.
But we have a pretty good idea that there's going to be demand for all types of technologists in
Get a
the
little
future.
closer to the mic.
We have a pretty good idea that there's going to be considerable demand for all types of people who really know technology in the future. What are the skills that are going to be necessary for those people who are not technologists but have to team with technology?
You know, technologists as a group do not have the most advanced social skills. I say this with all the love and affection in the world, but you know how to tell the extroverted computer scientist, right? He's the one that looks at your shoes when he's talking to you.
I haven't heard that one.
Have you not heard that? That's a great one. So what the geek world needs are the boundary spanners, are the people who can take that work and translate it and make it accessible and usable to the rest of humanity. To me, you know, genius is this terribly overused word. This is why Steve Jobs deserved that word, because he could work with some of the best technologists on the planet and convert it into devices and ecosystems that just pleased us so greatly and were usable by us. The geek world needs tons of people with those kinds of skills. Those are not all, you know, super high cognitive load skills or classic nerd skills. They're desperately needed in the world of technology.
Andy, thank you so much for kicking this off. It's always a treat. I could talk to you all morning.
Tom,
Really
always a
appreciate
pleasure.
it. Thanks so much.